The first time Jake Martinez heard the ATV engine roar to life at 6:47 a.m., he thought it was just another early morning hunter passing through the county roads. But when the sound grew louder instead of fading away, and when he watched from his kitchen window as a bright red four-wheeler burst through his damaged fence line like some kind of mechanical locust, he knew his peaceful Texas mornings were about to become a whole lot more complicated. Jake had inherited the 200-acre cattle ranch from his grandfather 3 years ago, and in all that time, the most exciting thing that had happened was when old Mrs. Henderson's chickens got loose and decided his prized tomatoes looked like an all-you-can-eat buffet. He was a simple man who liked simple things: black coffee, quiet sunrises, and cattle that weren't spooked into stampeding by inconsiderate neighbors with loud toys. The woman on the ATV, and he could tell it was a woman by the long blonde ponytail whipping behind her like a battle flag, didn't slow down as she carved fresh tire ruts through his carefully maintained pasture. She didn't wave. She didn't even acknowledge that she was tearing through someone else's property like she owned the place. She just gunned it straight across his land, scattering his cattle and leaving a cloud of dust in her wake before disappearing through another section of fence on the far side of his property. By the time Jake pulled on his boots and walked out to assess the damage, she was long gone. But the evidence remained: tire tracks cutting deep gouges in the soft morning earth, a fence post knocked askew, and 20 head of black Angus cattle still milling around nervously, their routine disrupted by the mechanical invasion. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake muttered, pushing his weathered cowboy hat back on his head. In the distance, Ferdinand, his temperamental 2,000-pound prize bull, snorted and pawed the ground, steam rising from his nostrils in the cool morning air. Even Ferdinand seemed to understand that something wasn't right about this picture. Jake figured it was a one-time thing. Maybe the woman was lost, maybe she was dealing with some kind of emergency. People made mistakes, took wrong turns, ended up places they shouldn't be. He was willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. That benefit evaporated the next morning when the red ATV came screaming across his property again at exactly 6:47 a.m. And the morning after that, and every single morning for the next 2 weeks, it became as reliable as sunrise itself. Jake would be standing at his kitchen sink, coffee mug in hand, when the distant whine of the engine would cut through the peaceful dawn. Then came the fence-rattling crash as she busted through his property line, followed by the thundering hooves of spooked cattle and Ferdinand's increasingly agitated bellowing. The woman, he'd learned from the county clerk that her name was Sarah Chen and she'd recently bought the old Morrison place about a mile east, had apparently decided that Jake's private property was her personal highway. Never mind that there was a perfectly good county road that would add maybe 3 minutes to her commute. Never mind that she was destroying his fences, stressing his livestock, and turning his peaceful ranch into her personal motocross track. Jake was a patient man, but patience had its limits. And Ferdinand, who had already earned a reputation as the most ill-tempered bull in 3 counties, was starting to take the daily intrusions personally. Every morning, Jake watched his prize bull get more and more agitated, charging at the fence line and snorting like a locomotive whenever that red ATV came tearing across the horizon. Something was going to have to give, and Jake had a feeling it wasn't going to be Sarah Chen's sense of entitlement. By the 3rd week, Sarah Chen had graduated from simple trespassing to what Jake could only describe as territorial conquest. It wasn't enough that she used his property as her personal shortcut anymore. Now she was treating it like her private playground. The first sign of escalation came on a Saturday morning when Jake discovered empty beer bottles scattered across his south pasture. Not just 1 or 2 bottles that might have fallen from a careless rider, but a whole collection arranged around what looked suspiciously like the remains of a small bonfire. Apparently, Sarah had decided his land was perfect for entertaining. Jake stood there holding a Bud Light bottle, shaking his head in disbelief. His grandfather had worked this land for 40 years, building it up from scrub brush and rocky soil into prime grazing territory. 3 generations of Martinez men had poured their sweat into every acre, and now some city woman was using it as her personal party spot. The documentation started that day. Jake pulled out his phone and began photographing everything. The broken fence posts that now numbered 8 instead of the original 2, the deep tire ruts that turned into muddy trenches whenever it rained, the areas where his grass was dying from motor oil leaks. He measured the damage with a tape measure and wrote everything down in a composition notebook, just like his grandfather had taught him to do with cattle records. But the real kicker came when Jake checked on his pregnant cow, Bessie, and found her stressed to the point where she stopped eating properly. The veterinarian confirmed what Jake already suspected. The daily disturbances were affecting his entire herd. Stressed cattle meant lower milk production, potential pregnancy complications, and thousands of dollars in lost revenue. "This has got to stop," Jake muttered to Ferdinand, who had taken to pacing along the fence line like a caged tiger whenever he heard the distant sound of Sarah's ATV warming up in the mornings. Jake's first attempt at civilized resolution came on a Tuesday afternoon when he drove over to the old Morrison place, now apparently transformed into what looked like a suburban McMansion transplanted onto rural Texas soil. Sarah answered the door wearing yoga pants and an attitude that suggested he was interrupting something far more important than his concerns about property damage. "Look, I don't know what your problem is," Sarah said before Jake could even finish explaining about the fence damage. "It's not like you're using that land for anything important. It's just empty space with some cows wandering around. I'm not hurting anybody." Jake felt his jaw tighten. "Ma'am, those cows are my livelihood. That empty space is private property that's been in my family for 3 generations, and you're causing hundreds of dollars in damage every week with your joyrides." Sarah crossed her arms and gave him a look that could have frozen hell over. "I paid good money for this house specifically because I wanted to be able to ride my ATV without dealing with city regulations. If you can't handle living in the country, maybe you should move back to whatever suburb you crawled out of." The irony of a woman who'd clearly never lived anywhere but strip malls and subdivisions telling him, a third-generation rancher, that he didn't belong in the country wasn't lost on Jake, but he kept his temper in check, tipped his hat politely, and drove home to call his lawyer. Attorney Michael Rodriguez listened to Jake's story with the patience of a man who'd heard it all before. "You've got a clear case for trespassing and property damage," he said. "But honestly, Jake, it's going to cost you more in legal fees than the actual damage is worth. These cases drag on forever, and people like this woman usually don't have the assets to make a judgment worthwhile anyway. So I'm just supposed to let her tear up my land? You could try small claims court, but my advice, document everything, install some cameras, and hope she gets bored and finds somewhere else to play with her toy." Jake hummed up, feeling more frustrated than ever. He'd worked his whole life to build something meaningful on this land, and some entitled city transplant was slowly destroying it one joyride at a time. The law was supposed to protect people like him, but apparently property rights only mattered if you had enough money to enforce them. That evening, as Jake walked out to check on his cattle, Ferdinand approached the fence with an unusual intensity. The massive bull had always been territorial, but lately he'd developed what could only be described as a personal vendetta against the sound of Sarah's ATV. Every morning when she came tearing across the pasture, Ferdinand would charge the fence line, snorting and bellowing like he was issuing a formal challenge. Jake reached out and scratched Ferdinand behind the ears, feeling the solid muscle and barely contained power of 2,000 pounds of irritated beef. "You don't like her much either, do you, big guy?" Ferdinand snorted and pawed the ground, steam rising from his nostrils in the evening air. In the distance, Jake could hear the faint sound of Sarah's ATV starting up for what was probably another evening joyride across his property. As he watched Ferdinand's reaction to the sound, an idea began to form in Jake's mind. Maybe the law couldn't help him, but he owned 200 acres of private property, and he had every right to decide which pasture his prize bull called home. Jake spent the next 3 days researching property law with the intensity of a man preparing for war. He pulled up Texas statutes on his laptop, called the county extension office, and even drove into town to consult with old Judge Morrison. No relation to the previous owners of Sarah's property, Ho had been settling land disputes since before Jake was born. "Son," Judge Morrison said, leaning back in his creaky office chair, "a man's got every right to put his livestock wherever he damn well pleases on his own land. Hell, you could put a circus elephant in that pasture if you wanted to, long as it's properly contained and you've got the right permits." The key word was contained. Jake's fencing was solid, had to be for insurance purposes and to keep Ferdinand from wandering into the county road. The bull had never shown any interest in breaking through the barriers anyway. He was territorial, not suicidal. But Jake wasn't stupid. He knew that moving Ferdinand to the exact pasture Sarah used for her daily joyrides could be seen as setting a trap, and that's where things got legally complicated. So he did his homework. Texas law was clear. Property owners had the right to use their land as they saw fit, including grazing livestock wherever they chose. Trespassers assumed all risks when entering private property, especially property clearly marked with no trespassing signs. And if someone got hurt while committing a crime, which trespassing definitely was, the property owner wasn't liable unless they created an intentionally dangerous situation. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Jake would move Ferdinand to the south pasture for completely legitimate ranching reasons. The grass was better there this time of year, and Ferdinand had been showing signs of restlessness in his current location. Any reasonable rancher would make the same decision. Of course, Jake would also need to post additional warning signs. Lots of them. Big, bright, legally required signs that would make it impossible for anyone to claim they hadn't been warned about the presence of a dangerous animal. Jake drove to the farm supply store and bought 12 danger, aggressive buell signs, each one bright yellow with bold black lettering visible from 50 yards away. He also picked up a no trespassed violators while be PROSECUTED sign big enough to be seen from space, and for good measure added a private PRPRTI keep out banner that he could string across the most obvious entry point. Installing the signs took most of Saturday morning. Jake positioned them at every possible entry point, along the fence line and at regular intervals throughout the pasture. By the time he was finished, you'd have to be blind or illiterate to miss the warnings about Ferdinand's presence. The next step was documentation. Jake had learned from his lawyer consultation that having evidence of everything was crucial. He installed 2 trail cameras, the kind hunters used to monitor deer, positioning them to capture the entire area where Sarah typically entered and exited his property. The cameras were motion-activated and would record both day and night footage. Finally, Jake called his insurance agent to discuss the situation. "I'm moving my bull to a different pasture," he explained. "Want to make sure I'm covered if someone trespasses and gets hurt. As long as the animal is properly contained and you posted appropriate warnings, you should be fine," the agent assured him. Trespassers assume all liability for their actions on private property. Just make sure you document everything and don't do anything that could be construed as creating an intentional hazard. On Sunday evening, Jake moved Ferdinand to his new home. The massive bull seemed pleased with the change of scenery, immediately claiming a spot near the center of the pasture where he could survey his new kingdom. The grass was indeed better here, and Ferdinand began grazing contentedly as the sun set behind him. Jake stood at the fence, watching his prize bull settle into the pasture that Sarah Chen had been treating as her personal highway for over a month. Ferdinand looked magnificent in the golden evening light, 2,000 pounds of muscle and attitude, with horns that could punch through a car door and a temperament that had earned him a reputation throughout the county. "Well, Ferdinand," Jake said quietly, "tomorrow's going to be interesting." That night, Jake barely slept. Part of him felt guilty about what he was doing, even though he knew it was perfectly legal and completely justified. He wasn't setting a trap, he was simply exercising his rights as a property owner while taking reasonable precautions to warn potential trespassers. But another part of him was excited in a way he hadn't felt since he was a kid waiting for Christmas morning. For weeks, he felt helpless while Sarah destroyed his property and dismissed his concerns. The law offered no quick relief, negotiation had failed, and his patience was exhausted. But now, finally, he was taking action. At 6:30 a.m., Jake positioned himself at his kitchen window with a cup of coffee and his phone ready to record. In the distance, he could hear Sarah's ATV warming up, the engine revving impatiently as she prepared for her daily violation of his property rights. Ferdinand heard it too. The bull's head came up from his grazing, ears forward, and he began moving toward the fence line with the purposeful stride of a creature who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Jake checked his phone. 6:46 a.m., right on schedule. The sound of the ATV grew louder, and Jake could see the familiar cloud of dust rising in the distance as Sarah approached the damaged section of fence she'd been using as her personal gateway. She was coming in fast, as always, probably already thinking about whatever entitled city person activity was waiting for her on the other side of his property. What she wasn't thinking about was Ferdinand, who had positioned himself directly in her path and was pawing the ground with the enthusiasm of a gladiator entering the arena. Jake raised his phone and started recording. After 4 weeks of watching his property get destroyed while the law told him to be patient, he was finally going to get some satisfaction. It was 6:47 a.m. and Sarah Chen was about 30 seconds away from meeting the most territorial bull in 3 counties. The red ATV burst through the damaged fence line exactly as it had every morning for the past month, kicking up a spray of dirt and morning dew. Sarah was hunched forward over the handlebars, her blonde ponytail streaming behind her like a war banner, completely focused on the path ahead that would take her across Jake's property in record time. She made it exactly 47 yards before she saw Ferdinand. The massive Angus bull stood directly in her path like a living mountain, his black coat gleaming in the early morning sun. 2,000 pounds of irritated beef, with shoulders that could flip a pickup truck and horns that gleamed like polished ivory. He wasn't grazing. He wasn't wandering aimlessly like cattle were supposed to do. He was standing perfectly still, head lowered, watching her approach with the focused intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. Jake watched from his kitchen window as Sarah's ATV began to slow, then swerve left as she tried to go around Ferdinand. But the bull wasn't having any of it. With surprising speed for such a massive animal, Ferdinand moved to block her path, snorting loud enough that Jake could hear it from 100 yards away. Sarah swerved right. Ferdinand countered, staying directly between her and her usual exit point on the far side of the pasture. The bull's message was crystal clear. "This is my territory now, and you're not welcome." What happened next unfolded like a scene from a nature documentary. Sarah, apparently deciding that intimidation was a two-way street, revved her engine and tried to charge straight at Ferdinand, probably thinking she could scare him off like she'd scattered the other cattle for weeks. Ferdinand had different ideas. The bull exploded into motion with a fury that made Jake's coffee mug freeze halfway to his lips. 2,000 pounds of muscle and testosterone launched forward like a freight train, covering the distance between himself and the ATV in what couldn't have been more than 3 seconds. His bellow echoed across the entire ranch, a sound somewhere between a foghorn and a war cry that probably woke up half the county. Sarah's courage evaporated the instant she realized Ferdinand wasn't backing down. She yanked the handlebars hard to the right, sending the ATV into a skidding turn that sprayed dirt everywhere. But Ferdinand was faster than physics, cutting off her escape route and forcing her into an increasingly desperate series of turns and evasive maneuvers. Jake had to admit Sarah could handle an ATV. She managed to stay ahead of Ferdinand for almost 2 full minutes, weaving and dodging through the pasture like she was running some kind of rodeo event. But Ferdinand had home field advantage, and more importantly, he had the rage of a bull who'd been listening to that damn engine every morning for a month. The end came when Sarah tried to make a sharp turn around a lone oak tree in the center of the pasture. The ATV's rear wheels hit a soft spot in the ground, and suddenly she was sliding sideways through the dirt while Ferdinand charged straight at her like a guided missile with hooves. Sarah abandoned ship. She rolled off the ATV and sprinted for the oak tree with Ferdinand in hot pursuit, scrambling up the trunk with a speed that would have impressed a monkey. The bull arrived at the base of the tree about 2 seconds after Sarah disappeared into the branches, and his frustration at being denied his target was audible from Jake's kitchen. Ferdinand circled the tree once, snorting and pawing the ground, then positioned himself directly under Sarah's perch like a guard dog with an attitude problem. The abandoned ATV sat about 20 feet away, engine still running, but it might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did her now. Jake finished his coffee, grabbed his phone, and walked out to assess the situation. He could hear Sarah yelling from her tree, a steady stream of profanity and demands that became clearer as he approached. "Get this thing away from me," she screamed. "I'm calling the police. This is assault. This is attempted murder." Jake stopped at the fence line, careful to stay outside Ferdinand's territory. "Morning, Sarah," he called up pleasantly. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Don't you morning Sarah me, you psychopath. Get this monster away from me right now." "Well, that's Ferdinand," Jake said, scratching his chin thoughtfully. "He's my prize bull. Pretty impressive, isn't he? Won 3 county fairs running. I don't care if he won the Nobel Prize. Get him away from me." Jake pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. "You know, Sarah, I'm a little confused about why you're on my property in the first place. Didn't we have a conversation about this just last week? This is kidnapping, false imprisonment. I'm going to sue you for everything you're worth." "Now hold on there," Jake said, his voice still maddeningly calm. "You're the one who chose to trespass on my property. You're the one who chose to ignore all those bright yellow warning signs I put up. And you're definitely the one who chose to charge at my bull with a motorized vehicle, which I'm pretty sure constitutes animal harassment." From her perch 15 feet up the oak tree, Sarah's face was turning an interesting shade of purple. "Those signs weren't there yesterday." "Been there since Saturday," Jake replied, pointing to the nearest danger, aggressive BUL sign, right next to that big no trespassing banner. You know, the one you drove right past about 5 minutes ago. Ferdinand, apparently bored with standing guard, wandered over to Sarah's ATV and began investigating it with the curiosity of a creature who'd never seen such a noisy, smelly intruder before. His massive head had lowered to sniff the seat, and his horn scraped along the side panel with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. "He's damaging my ATV," Sarah shrieked. "Hud," Jake said, watching Ferdinand explore the four-wheeler. "Ferdinand's never seen one of those before. I wonder what he thinks it is. Probably figures it's some kind of weird, loud animal that invaded his territory." As if to prove Jake's point, Ferdinand gave the ATV an experimental nudge with his massive head. The vehicle rocked sideways, and Ferdinand snorted with what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. "Stop him. He's destroying my property." Jake shrugged. "Can't really control what Ferdinand does on his own pasture. Bull's got to be a bull, you know. Besides, I'm sure your insurance will cover any damage that occurred while you were trespassing on private property." For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Sarah Chen was completely speechless. Jake checked his watch, 9:15 a.m. He had cattle to feed and fences to repair. The ones Sarah had been damaging for the past month. Ferdinand seemed content to stand guard under the oak tree, occasionally wandering over to investigate the ATV further. "Tell you what, Sarah," Jake called up to the tree. "I got work to do, but I'll check back on you in a few hours. Maybe Ferdinand will get bored and wander off by then. Or maybe you'll figure out how to apologize for a month's worth of property damage and promise to stay off my land." "You can't just leave me here." Sarah's voice cracked with genuine panic now. Actually, I can, Jake said, already walking back toward his house. See, this is my property and Ferdinand is my bull, and you're the one who chose to trespass. Legally speaking, you're responsible for whatever situation you've gotten yourself into. Behind him, Sarah's protests grew louder and more creative, but Jake kept walking. He had a ranch to run, and for the first time in a month, he was going to be able to do it without the sound of an ATV tearing across his property. Ferdinand, meanwhile, had discovered that the ATV made interesting metallic sounds when scratched with horns, and he was conducting what appeared to be a thorough acoustic investigation. 3 hours later, Jake returned to find Sarah still perched in the oak tree like an angry, sunburned bird. Ferdinand had settled into a comfortable spot directly beneath her, chewing his cud with the contentment of a security guard who took his job seriously. The ATV, meanwhile, had accumulated several new scratches, a dented fender, and what appeared to be hoof prints on the seat. You came back, Sarah croaked, her voice hoarse from 3 hours of shouting threats at an unimpressed bull. Told you I would, Jake replied cheerfully. How's the weather up there? This isn't funny. I've been calling the sheriff for 2 hours. Jake pulled out his own phone and showed her the screen. Yeah, Sheriff Martinez called me about an hour ago. That's my cousin, by the way. We had a nice long chat about property rights and trespassing laws. Sarah's face went pale beneath her sunburn. Your cousin? Third-generation law enforcement, just like I'm third-generation rancher. Funny how that works in small towns. Jake leaned against the fence post, clearly enjoying himself. Anyway, Carlos, that Sheriff Martinez to you, said the funniest thing. Apparently, someone called to report being attacked by a vicious animal while innocently driving through the countryside. That's exactly what happened. Well, that's where it gets interesting, Jake continued. See, Carlos pulled up the GPS coordinates from your phone call, and wouldn't you know it, they put you right smack in the middle of my private property. The same property where I've filed multiple trespassing complaints over the past month. Sarah's grip on the tree branch tightened. I want to press charges. That bull attacked me. Ferdinand didn't attack anybody, Jake said, scratching the bull behind the ears. Ferdinand rumbled with pleasure, never taking his eyes off the woman in the tree. He just defended his territory from an intruder, which, according to Carlos, is exactly what bulls are supposed to do. Over the next hour, Jake laid out the legal reality with the patience of a teacher explaining arithmetic to a slow student. The warning signs were clearly posted and photographed. The trespassing was documented by multiple trail cameras. Sarah's own phone calls to 911 had provided GPS evidence of her location on private property, and Texas law was crystal clear about assuming risk when trespassing. Your insurance company is going to love this, Jake added helpfully. Nothing quite like a claim for damage that occurred while committing a crime. By noon, Sarah had finally accepted that Ferdinand wasn't going anywhere until he was good and ready. Jake, taking pity on her despite everything, brought a ladder and helped her down from the tree. Ferdinand watched the entire process with the alert interest of a bouncer, making sure the troublemaker actually left the building. Sarah's ATV was still functional, though it now sported Ferdinand's artistic touches in the form of horn scratches and hoof dents. She drove it out of Jake's pasture at exactly the speed limit, probably the first time she's shown such respect for rules in her entire life. But Sarah Chen wasn't finished. 2 days later, Jake received a summons to appear in small claims court. Sarah was suing for damages to her ATV, emotional distress, and false imprisonment. She had also filed a complaint with animal control about Ferdinand being a dangerous animal. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday, and by Wednesday night, half the county knew about it. Word traveled fast in rural Texas, especially when it involved someone getting their comeuppance from a bull. Thursday morning, the courthouse was packed. Jake arrived to find a line of pickup trucks in the parking lot and a crowd of ranchers, farmers, and townspeople filing into the small courtroom. Apparently, Sarah's lawsuit had struck a nerve with folks who dealt with their own entitled newcomers over the years. Judge Morrison, the same one Jake had consulted about property law, presided over the hearing with the weary expression of a man who'd seen this particular brand of stupidity before. Sarah, dressed in a business suit that probably cost more than Jake's truck, presented her case with the righteous indignation of someone who'd never been held accountable for anything in her life. She spoke about emotional trauma, property damage, and the aggressive, dangerous animal that had terrorized her. Jake's defense was simpler. He presented his documentation, the trespassing complaints, the photographs of fence damage, the trail camera footage of Sarah's daily violations, and the GPS evidence from her own 911 calls. His lawyer, the same one who'd initially advised him that litigation wasn't worth it, seemed to be enjoying himself immensely. Your Honor, the lawyer said, my client legally moved his livestock to his own pasture, posted appropriate warnings, and documented everything according to Texas law. The plaintiff chose to ignore multiple warning signs and trespass on private property. She has no legal standing to complain about the natural consequences of her own illegal actions. The coup de grace came when Jake's lawyer played the 911 recording of Sarah's frantic call from the tree. Her own words, preserved forever, admitted to being on Jake's property without permission while trying to get to the main road. Judge Morrison didn't even need to recess to consider his verdict. "Case dismissed," he said firmly. "Ms. Chen, you're lucky Mr. Martinez is only asking for reimbursement of his legal fees and fence repairs. In my day, trespassing on a man's land could get you a lot worse than a few hours in a tree." The courtroom erupted in applause, and Sarah fooled without another word. Animal Control's investigation of Ferdinand lasted exactly one visit. The officer, a rancher himself, took one look at the properly posted signs, the secure fencing, and Ferdinand's calm demeanor around people who weren't trespassing, and closed the case immediately. Within a week, Sarah had put her house on the market. The for sale sign went up on a Tuesday, and by Friday, moving trucks were loading her belongings. She'd apparently decided that rural Texas wasn't quite the paradise she'd imagined. Jake's new neighbors turned out to be Henderson's nephew and his wife, a young couple who'd grown up on farms and understood the unwritten rules of rural life. Their first act was to bring Jake a homemade apple pie and apologize for Sarah's behavior, even though they had nothing to do with it. "Some folks just don't understand country ways," the husband said, shaking Jake's hand. "We sure appreciate you taking care of that situation." On their first morning in the house, Jake woke up at 6:47 a.m. out of habit. But instead of the angry whine of an ATV engine, he heard only the peaceful sounds of cattle lowing and birds singing. Ferdinand stood in his pasture, surveying his domain with the satisfaction of a warrior who defended his territory and won. Jake poured his coffee, walked out to the fence, and scratched Ferdinand behind the ears. "Well, old boy, looks like we've got our peace and quiet back." Ferdinand snorted softly and returned to his grazing, but Jake could swear the bull was smiling. In the months that followed, the story of Ferdinand and the trespasser became local legend. Ranchers would tell it at the feed store, parents would share it as a cautionary tale about respecting other people's property, and Ferdinand himself became something of a celebrity at the county fair. Jake never had another trespassing problem. Word had gotten around that the Martinez Ranch was protected by the most territorial bull in 3 counties, and most folks were smart enough to take the hint. But every morning at 6:47 a.m., Jake still found himself listening for the sound of an ATV engine just in case, and Ferdinand, now in his prime at 3 years old and 2,200 pounds of pure attitude, continued to patrol his territory with the dedication of a creature who knew exactly what his job was. Some problems, Jake had learned, couldn't be solved by lawyers or laws or polite conversation. Sometimes you needed a bull with a bad attitude and the legal right to let him do what bulls do best: protect what's theirs. And in rural Texas, that was a lesson that tended to stick.